So I used to live in northern Arizona, in a town called Page. The town is on Lake Powell, and nearby Horseshoe Bend, which are both massive tourist attractions recently. It also happened to border the Navajo reservation, and has a population that is majority native. I'm currently 18. I moved away less than a month ago, so I lived my whole life in the town essentially. I've heard stories, many stories from my friends and their parents as well, but these two stories are my actual experiences. The first story happened about a year and a half ago. Since Page is a 60-mile drive from the next closest town, the nearby area is very popular among locals for jackrabbit, coyote, and bobcat hunting. This particular day, I was out on my own pretty far back on some of the local dirt trails. Pretty recently, after I had started hunting myself. My target was coyotes. This was before I had a call, so I had to look for them or bait them. And my firearm was a Springfield Saint AR-15, loaded with American Eagle 5.5 grain AP shells, which, yes, is an important detail. It was probably around noon, and I had wandered down into a wash that ran up and across the bottom of one of the sandstone cliffs of the area. While walking through the wash, I scared probably the biggest coyote I had ever seen up the side of a cliff face. As it was scaling, I took 3 shots at it, and I was able to hit at least one, because it started bleeding quite profusely as it made its way up and over the top of the cliff. I gave pursuit, and probably scaled the face in 3 to 4 minutes of winded climbing. At the top, the cliff turned into a flat mesa, covered by shrubs and dried up bushes, probably about knee height at most. I'm 5'10", so not very tall, but there was no coyote in sight. I started to follow the blood trail, and after about 20 minutes of following, I was very confused and somewhat concerned. The blood trail was still thick. Too much was being spilled to allow the coyote to continue for a straight sprint for that long. And I was hunting with a round that would drop a mountain lion in its tracks. After about 10 more minutes, the tracks from the coyote met up with tracks from what I'm assuming were goat tracks. This is where I turned and got the hell out of there. Both tracks were recent, deep, and the sand was still loose enough to fall when I knelt down and looked at them. The tracks split from each other, the coyote going far off to the left, and the goat going to the right. The blood trail, though, no longer followed the track of the coyote, but instead indicated that the goat had been shot. The tracks led down to another wash, known in the area for being bad news, so I got back to my truck fast after that. The second story took place near the outskirts of town, and has a video that comes with it. We and my friends were out at around 10 at night, near one of the local jogging trails. At the edge of these trails, a storm drain tunnel opening sticks out. We always used to joke about skinwalkers using it to hide from joggers or bikers, but we'd never paid it much attention. This night though, we decided to go into the storm drain to see for ourselves. I, of course, was the first one in, but had 5 people behind me. We were probably about 300 feet in, when I heard what sounded like claws scraping against concrete ahead of me. I could only see about 50 feet in front of me with my light, so I shushed everyone behind me. As soon as we got quiet, a moan resonates through the tunnel. I've never backtracked on all 4s so fast in my life. The storm drain leads to a nearby road, which the people who were too scared to go into the tunnel were looking at, but they were not on the road or anywhere near the opening of the road, and were even taking Snapchats at the time of the noise, showing us that 1 it wasn't them, and 2, there were no cars on the road at this time. I can't prove that these were skinwalkers, but they definitely weren't any person or animal that I have ever encountered in my life. If you'd like to see the video, the link is in the description. I am a 24-year-old female that moved from Orlando, Florida to 18 miles outside of Valdosta, Georgia, basically the middle of nowhere. It was to my family's farm. I never had any issues in Orlando, but I got divorced and had to move in with my mother. It was my 2 small boys and I. Anyway, we moved into one of the old farmhouses on my family's farm, and it needed a lot of work. It was 8 bedrooms and a mother-in-law suite. When we moved in, we only had 2 rooms cleaned up and worked on the rest of the house over the course of the 9 months. The man across the street, Jay, was very helpful. From day 1, he would come over almost every day, as he was feeding up his animals and help with anything I needed. Over the course of 9 months, I never had any issues and thought he was just a friendly middle-aged man. I never felt he had any ill intentions. The farmhouse was in a U-shape. The room I chose had windows in the courtyard area. This was the middle of the house. Jay had fenced in that area when I first moved in, so that I could let the boys play. The farmhouse was in the middle of the farm, and set off the road, so I never had any worries of being watched, mostly as my bedroom windows are in the fenced-in area, in the middle of the house, so I didn't put curtains on my bedroom or bathroom. One day, my son was playing under the carport, and Jay pulled up in his truck. He was going to look at my car for me. Jay didn't make it to the carport before my eldest son says to me, "Hey, I saw him in my window last night." Later that night, I talked to my son, and he told me he did see him out a window. I asked him if it was the kitchen window, because you can see his horse pastures, and he stops to feed them every morning and night. Chalking it up to that, I didn't think much else about it. But other things had happened. I guess you could say I wanted him to be the person I thought he was, so I overlooked a lot. My favorite candy somehow appeared in my fridge one day after school. My mum told me she remembered me telling Jay it was my favorite, and someone sent me flowers every Friday for a couple of months. I thought it was my ex-husband, or possibly my boyfriend at the time, but neither man would admit to it. My boyfriend jokingly told me it was Jay. The next day I came home from school, and my mum had the boys playing under the carport, and Jay was working on my car. My air suspension had a leak, and Jay offered to look at it before I took it all the way to Tallahassee for the expensive repair. I got out of my mother's car, and he asked me if he wanted to see the leak I had found. As I bent over the hood, Jay stepped back. When I turned around, I commented jokingly on his 90s era cell phone he had in his hand. It's the type you don't see anymore, like a very early camera flip phone. Later that night, we came inside, and my mum told me she could swear that Jay had taken a picture of me on his phone. I know it sounds crazy, but I didn't believe her. This man was seriously always friendly. Never any weird vibes from him. If I offered to pay him, it was always at cost, and that was rare, as he would not accept my money. I should have known that people just aren't like that these days. I guess I was very naive. A couple of weeks later, I was mowing my courtyard. It was growing up pretty bad, and as I got close to my window, my heart literally sank to my butt. I had a newly placed center block outside both windows and my bathroom window. I can't tell you how, but I knew at that point I had made a huge mistake, and everyone was right about Jay. I called my friend and neighbor Josh to come look at the center blocks. He ran home and got a deer cam, attaching it to a tree outside my window. This was at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. That night I came home around 6 and was unloading the boys when I turned around, and Jay was standing right behind me. He said that he didn't mean to scare me, and he heard from my mother that I was out of town. I said, "Yes, sir." I knew he knew, because they are friends on Facebook. He told me to call him if I got scared or needed anything. I got the boys inside, and we got snuggled into bed. They fell asleep in my bed when I realized that I had missed Sunday's Game of Thrones episode. It was a really good one. So I went to my mother's bed to watch. I was laying there talking to my ex-husband about the boys and the show when Josh called. I clicked over and he asked me if my boyfriend was over. I told him no, that it was 9:02 p.m. and he told me that a man is outside my window. The deer cam snapped the first picture at 9:02. My boys are in my room sleeping. Josh told me not to worry. He was already coming up the driveway, and to meet him outside the other side of the house. Fear and dread literally drained through me. I slowly walked into the other room and calmly scooped up my boys. I shut the door and sprinted through the house as fast as I could. We sat in Josh's truck until the police arrived. The deer cam snapped photos at 9:02, 9:22, and 9:30. He stood outside my window that long waiting for me to come back. The police walked back into the field and could see where he was parking, but he had already gone. Behind the house is a massive produce field, and it was a tractor road for tractor access. I showed them the photos and ID'd Jay. He was arrested at 2 a.m. that morning, and when they went through his phone, there were 9 months worth of pictures. Pictures of me mowing, pictures of me playing with my kids, pictures of me in my bathroom, sleeping, bending over the hood of my car. He was watching me the entire time. I couldn't and didn't sleep for weeks. He ended up getting out of jail the following weekend and came into my mum's post office, she is a mail lady, to tell her that he found my dog dead and he buried it for me. And even after that, I only received 5 years probation and a restraining order. He still lives across the street. I stayed for maybe 3 months and then moved on to Fort Wharton Beach. This happened to me just a few days ago. My wife and I were backcountry camping in Redwood National Park in California, and as we went to sleep, a heavy fog rolled in. I was sleeping soundly in the tent, but at around 3 a.m. I woke up suddenly with a sense that something was outside the tent. I heard the sound of light, muffled footsteps, and a quiet hissing or whispering sound, almost like something was muttering to itself. Assuming it was a bear or raccoon, I gently unzipped the rainfly of my tent and looked out. As soon as I opened the tent, the muttering sound ceased. The fog was so thick, I could barely see more than 15 feet away. The moon and the night sky weren't visible at all. I turned on my headlamp to get a better look, and in the distance I see a faint light turn on as well. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, although we were about 15 miles out and in the backcountry, but it was a yellowish/orange flickering light only a couple of feet off the ground. I see a silhouette of a humanoid shape that almost looks like it's beckoning to me. I grab my knife, get out of my sleeping bag, and walk into the night. As I approached the light, I could see the humanoid shape more and more clearly, but I started to get really unnerved. It doesn't move, it doesn't make any noise. Who or what would be out here at 3 a.m. 15 miles into the woods? I turned once to look back at my tent, and when I turned back around, the light was gone. The next morning we searched the area where I saw the light, but we didn't see any tracks. The thing that scared me the most, though, is that right near where the light was, there was a 50-foot cliff leading into the stream below. I live in the woodlands part of the Upper Panhandle near Pittsburgh. While some of the town is buildings and restaurants, when you leave town, it gets pretty scary. We have what I think is a natural reserve called Tomlinson Run. They have hiking and camping trails. To set the scene, it was a very muggy summer day, around mid-June, with heavy rain. I was out with my friends, going on a camping trip in the woods. We were going to go into the woods, but it was easier just to get a small cabin. They provide you with a fire pit around the back near the tree line. We were sitting at the fire having a few beers when it started to pour rain. The heavy brush of trees over the top of us hid us from the rain for the most part, so we stayed out near the fire. Once it started to fall off the leaves, we decided to call it a night. While packing up and being pretty tipsy, my friend Alex went to take a whiz. The only bathrooms in the park are at a building about a mile away, so it was common to just do your business by a shack. Keeping the fire dimly lit while we were packing proved to be a challenging task. All of a sudden, while peeing, he turned around and started yelling to go inside. Him, not being one to joke around and having a serious tone, persuaded us to move our quichetas. We grabbed all of our chairs and firewood and hauled it into the cabin. He came in about 10 seconds after us and locked the door. He explained that he saw a wolf along the tree line off to our right stalking us, maybe looking for an easy snack. Now, to make sure you get the layout of the cabins, I'll explain. Each cabin had 4 beds and 1 platform in the roof that someone could sleep in. The 2 beds are bunkers, and each had a window above the first bed and below the second. There was also a window on the top bed. The cabin was designed like an old Indian cabin, with a round room and squared off walls. Being a cheap $50 a night cabin, there were no lights or power outlets in this one. We expected this, having been there several times, so we brought flashlights and portable chargers. Once we got inside, we all kind of just laid there planning out our next day, since there were 4 of us. I decided to sleep on the 2nd floor bed, and took the ladder up and pulled it to form a railing. We all dozed off as it had been a long day. About halfway through the night, what I would guess to be around 2 a.m., I woke up to find my friend James sprinting into the room screaming. Apparently he had been outside peeing when he thought he heard a wolf howl, but in a deep tone. This was strange, as we had never seen many wolves around, and they usually had high-pitched howls. When he went on to say that when he turned to look to where he heard the noise, he saw something standing on 2 feet, with claw-like hands looking back at him. This freaked us all out, and we decided not to go outside until the morning. We all got back into our beds, and I turned over and tried to fall asleep. I had a very uneasy feeling in my stomach, and felt as if someone was watching me. I rolled over and looked out the window, and that's when I saw it. It was crouching down facing away from me, but its head was turned, staring at me. As soon as I realized I was looking, it stood up and sprinted away. Not like any sprint or person I'd ever seen. It was about 8 feet tall and ran like an Olympian. I tried to brush it off as a hallucination, but I knew that what I had seen was real. The next day we all agreed to leave, and I told my friends in the car what I had seen. Alex then said that's what he saw when he was peeing, but didn't want to freak us out, so he stayed quiet. I wasn't sure what it was until I researched it some more. To this day, I haven't been back to that campsite or into the woods. Sometimes, when I'm walking at night around my neighborhood, I can feel eyes on me, and I know exactly what is watching me. A few years after my father had graduated from CSU, and my mother had graduated from TCU, they both had jobs at a small company in Fort Worth, Texas. Having met at a few company parties and hitting off things a few years later, they finally got married, and my father got a job in Colorado for a small but growing engineering company. So off they pack and move from Fort Worth, Texas to Colorado. Getting in a car with their few belongings, they start to make their way there. Now I'm not sure why they took the road they did, but instead of a larger interstate highway, my mother and father decided to take a smaller, not-so-traveled highway on their final stretch back to my father's hometown to catch Highway 14 to their new home. Having driven all day, and it being the middle of the night, my father had the idea of pulling off to the side of the road to sleep for a few hours, before waking up and finishing out the journey. Bear in mind, there were no rest stops on this highway, so it was either side of the road or nowhere to rest. My mother agreed, but maybe 20 minutes after stopping and trying to get sleep, my mother didn't feel comfortable, and decided instead of sleeping here, she would drive while my father rested, and when he woke up she would rest while he took over. Just to reiterate, this is a not-so-traveled highway, so there are no lights, and my parents are in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest city or town is miles away. Not a mile or two down the road, my mother notices something on the side of the road, and she gets closer and notices it is just a single man in the middle of nowhere, with no lights or anything, just walking on the side of the road in the direction of where my parents were just parked. There were no broken down cars further up the road, and there was nothing in miles to justify why this man would be walking on the side of the road. My parents don't bring it up much, but they have wondered what would have happened if they'd both fallen asleep in their car on the side of the road that night. I'm going to try and give as many details as possible. I live in Ohio around Youngstown, and my family owns a cabin in Pennsylvania near the Allegheny forest. It's my grandpa's cabin, and he's a retired firefighter. Years ago, he and his firefighter friends would go hunting in the forest. His friends stayed in a tree stand, while the rest were spread out amongst the property in various stands. Around lunchtime, they planned to meet up and eat. Calling the friend, he wouldn't answer for anyone over any sort of walkie-talkie or anything. They decided to meet up and go check on him. They found him petrified, hiding duck down in the stand. They said small trees looked like they'd been snapped with ease. He was as white as a ghost. He claimed there was a large, estimated 8-foot-tall humanoid creature that stunk so bad he had been tearing down trees left, right, and center, and walked under the stand, so tall his head almost touched it. He had no idea what it was, and in all his years of hunting, he had never seen anything like it. He didn't know what to think of it. My grandpa is very skeptical, and wouldn't make up this story for no reason whatsoever. It just makes you think. In Mexico, my aunt/grandma used to always tell us stories about people going to the hills at night, getting paralyzed in place by coyotes, and that people would wear coyote hairs as magic. My mum and many others had been followed by large black dogs, and sometimes their paths blocked. My grandma used to always put scissors in the shape of a cross above our doorway. It was said to keep witches away. I have heard of many people talking about an Indian that lives in the hills past the mine. They say that they bring the guy food, and he tends to stay away from people. And he speaks broken Spanish. Everyone talks about witches living out there beyond the village in the hills, that cartel members hire them to put curses on their enemies. I heard that the cartels would even kidnap kids and give them to the witches as payment. Near our village, there's an abandoned mine where people always go for hikes. One night, me and my uncle went all around the hills, past a lake, and through an oasis. This trek we started at 11 p.m, and we got home at 7 a.m. Nothing happened that night, and it was also the last year I saw my uncle the way I used to look up to him. He was an outdoorsy type with a missing finger, and always carried a large knife, a rifle, and was broad and unrelenting. And I always compared him to Crocodile Dundee, and we used to always go on hikes when herding sheep. I had trouble keeping up with him, but he knew the land very well and moved through the rocky hills with agility. After the years this happened, the following year I visited, he had become the laughingstock of the town, a drunk, skin and bones, teeth falling out, a weak man who was always shaky. The heir to my grandparents' land. He had been respected before, along with my other uncles. Now even they looked down on him and were embarrassed. Only last year had I seen him at his peak, when we went on that 8-hour hike to go hare hunting. The moon was full and everything out of the hills was illuminated. On our hike I asked him, what would we do if we saw a coyote? He joked and said that coyote hairs are good luck, and he'd wear one on his belt to get better luck with the ladies. Then he followed it by saying they're more scared of us than we are of them. I'll skip everything leading up to it, but we have 2 dogs with us, both German Shepherds. One of our dogs went ahead to the mine, which was still a good 10 minutes from sight. There were holes all over the ground, so we were going slowly. They both would occasionally get ahead of us and wait for us, or come back and repeat. They knew the path well, so it wasn't unusual for them to go ahead and wait for us near the mine. At this point it was around 3 a.m. Right as we were reaching it, we saw a big white owl flying overhead, and my uncle joked that it was a witch. We still didn't see the other dog that had gone ahead, but Tambo, the one that stayed alongside us, wouldn't stop growling at it. It was growling like that earlier, when the dogs had found a rattlesnake, so I didn't think much of it. I had a very uneasy feeling in my stomach though. I told my uncle I said I was going to go check if the mine was flooded, while he was looking for Firulisi, the other dog. While I was inside with the flashlight, I didn't hear any bats. Usually you would hear them chirping away. It was eerie silent. I wanted to make it to the end, where there was some writing on the walls, but just as I thought, it was flooded a fourth of the way in, and I hadn't explored the other paths that forked out yet. This next part sent shivers up my spine, and I still remember my body tensing up. While walking, my shoes got wet, and they were making a squeaky noise as I walked. When I saw it was flooded, I turned around to head back. My flashlight began dimming. I wasn't worried because that happened when you went in deep. It was just weird that it hadn't happened earlier. Looking back at it, I hadn't even gone deep enough for it to start dimming yet. I stopped walking, but I could still hear shoes squeaking. They were coming from behind me. It was the exact same noise my shoes were making. It sounded squishy and rubbery. I was completely frozen in place for a split second, just to make sure it wasn't an echo. Nope. It was getting closer too, and coming from one of the forked paths. The wet squeaking sounded like my shoes. Then I heard someone say, "Tambo?" in an almost mocking manner. At least I think I did, because it didn't sound right. I flashed my flashlight towards it. I panicked. Only my uncle had a rifle on him. The one I usually used was lent out to someone. All I had was a slingshot. I grabbed it for the sling so that I could fling the whole thing, and I didn't have a rock. I really can't describe what I saw, because every time I try to remember, it just looks like a tall blur with a smile. I just remember it moving like it was jerking around. I don't know if it had yellow eyes, because it could have easily just been the reflection of the flashlight, but it looked like a person if they were out of focus. I threw my slingshot at it, and it just made a noise like a screeching tire. I ran, and ran, and ran, and rolled my ankles, and I kept on running without looking back. When I went outside, I saw Tambo growling at me. He kept growling at the entrance, and then I ran past him too. Tambo started following me, whispering. I wanted to go to my uncle because he was like a mountain. I was tearing up. We were a good 3 hours from anyone else, and I thought we were going to die. I just wanted to get my uncle, because at the time I felt like he could take down anything. I really felt like it was the end. I saw my uncle about 50 feet away, kneeling down, and I could see the rifle on his back shining in the moonlight. When I reached him, he was crying. He was knelt over the body of Furulisi. It had a knife stuck in it. He said he found him like this. I turned my back towards him and looked behind me. I couldn't stop looking around. I talked with my uncle, with my back to him, and he was kneeling down over the dog. Tambo was licking the body, and it sounded like he was crying too. It was completely silent, but now we could hear coyotes howling all around us. I couldn't shake the feeling like we were being watched. We were surrounded by hills, and all I could hear was the nearby stream. Once all the howling stopped, my uncle put the body in a crevice. He also looked on edge, and it seemed as if he was constantly looking over his shoulder. At this point, we just began making our way home. We did not say a single word to each other the entire walk back. I didn't tell him what I saw until much later. He never even noticed how spooked I was. I am a fly fisherman who spends every weekend out hiking remote rivers and streams in search of brown trout. I live in Montreal. My usual routine is to drive down to a river that starts in upstate New York, fish a couple of kilometers of the river where no one really lives or goes, then head across the border to head back down to the river on the Canadian side. So I'm out there one morning by myself. I had been out there over 100 times, so it wasn't new territory by any means. That said, I was getting close to the area where other anglers had warned me about angry landowners and threats from dudes with shotguns, so I was pretty alert. I come down to the section of river, and there's kind of a split, around a little island of 50 to 100 feet. But it reconnects, and the Houx River veers off to the left. Most days I stay left of the island. There are a few holes, and this day I went right, so my view up the river was obscured until I came around a corner of the island. I get to the point, look up about 250 feet in front of me, and standing there is this beige golden animal crossing the river. My first thought was it's someone's dog. No, too remote of an area. I'm standing there looking at this thing crossing the river, and things are racing through my head, because what I'm looking at doesn't make sense to me from where I'm standing. This thing still hasn't seen me. It's just gingerly making its way through about 1 or 2 feet of water, trying to cross across at a determined walk. That's when I notice the tail. I know a lot of dogs, but I've never seen a tail like... And then the hair on the back of my neck goes up. I'm looking at a mountain lion in upstate New York, about 1 kilometer from the Canadian border. I step back behind a tree. I stood there for a few more seconds waiting for it to cross. When it got to the other side, there was no doubt in what I'd seen. I decided that I've gone far enough for the day and began making my way back to the truck, which, with the way the river bends, is pretty much in the same direction the cat was going. Oh dear. I get back to the truck, make my way home, and contact the New York Fish and Game. I provide some data, and they say they'll look into it. Most buddies who I fish with out there think I'm nuts, obviously. And then my parents send me a clip from a local newspaper about a month later, confirming that it's been spotted. A couple of years later, I come across another article. So needless to say, I feel a little less crazy. My fellow anglers and I exercised a little more caution in that area henceforth. You know, when I saw this cat, he didn't see me. The wind was in the right direction, so I doubt he smelled me, but I didn't even get a glance from him. So, while obviously rattled, I didn't fear for my life at that moment. A year or so later, the same river but about 6 to 7 kilometers away, I was out fishing one evening. It was roughly 7 to 7:30 on a June evening. I was alone, and I could without a doubt hear something sneaking through the woods making its way towards me. I'd hear a branch crack and silence. Maybe a few steps. It was weird. It started off way off, and it just got closer and closer to me. I called out. If someone's out there, there's no need to sneak around. It was dead quiet. I fished a few more minutes, and this thing was just creeping closer and closer. It got about 30 feet from me, but I couldn't see into the bush. It was too dark. There was too much bush. I could feel the eyes. I backed out of the river, and the eyes never left the spot until I reached the far bank. And I walked about 1/2 kilometer down the stream on the opposite side of the bank from the sounds to a different spot. I get down there, and within 30 minutes, whatever it was has followed me and was creeping up on me again. I was thinking that this wasn't funny anymore. I scream out into the silence, "Hey dude, this isn't funny anymore." And I met with silence. Okay, enough of this. I backed out of the river and back up to my vehicle and got the hell out of there. I really felt like I was being stalked, and let me tell you, it was not a fun experience. The spot where I fish, 2 to 3 kilometers on both sides of the border, I've just seen some weird stuff. Everything from weird shady campsites that are way too close to the border that pop up overnight, to being stalked at dusk, escaped convicts, mountain lions, hunters, and angry landowners. Sometimes if you go down there and the wind is right, you can literally hear voices come from all around you. Now I know that that sounds insane, but I've been down there with 6 people, and we've all heard it. The stuff I go through just to hook a few nice brown trout. Back in high school, my friends and I would always go to one of our friends' houses that was on the outskirts of farmland / Amish country. The rest of us lived closer to town, and we always left at the late hours of the night. One night at around 1 a.m, I was driving my friend home. While I was driving, my friend was chatting with me about life when we drove up a hill. When we got to the bottom of the hill, my headlights illuminated this weird white figure on the side of the road. From what I remember, it was big enough to not be mistaken for an animal, and it looked as white as snow. It was a weird humanish figure, and in the few seconds I saw it, it twitched and moved strangely. As we drove past it, my friend and I both stopped talking and remained silent for a few seconds when I asked him if he saw what I saw. Now, my friend thinks the supernatural and bizarre are all total bollocks. He hates scary stuff like stories, and he thinks it's all fake, which is reasonable. But having my friend say that he saw the same thing, and not knowing what he saw, scared me. The rest of the night went fine, but we did have trouble sleeping that night, trying to figure out what it was we saw. To this day, we still don't know what it was. It freaks me right out. When I was younger, I used to horseback around Northern California for weeks at a time. This was during the late 70s and early 80s. I rarely used a compass, but I always had a map of my area. I'm pretty good at dead reckoning via landmarks. I've never been lost in my life, except once. I was in the Six Rivers National Forest, heading south towards Trinity County. This is very rough terrain. Lots of high ridges, steep hills, and rocks everywhere, and nasty brush to tangle you. I was riding the ridges, heading generally south, and trying to find easy places to cross to the next ridge when it became convenient. The skies were partially cloudy, and it was a cool 60 Fahrenheit, cold for that time of year since it was early August, and the temperatures usually lingered around 90 Fahrenheit plus during the day. I found a reasonable spot to cross over the next ridge south of me and started down. When I got into the ravine, it turned out that what looked easy from above was actually a rocky nightmare. I started walking up the ravine to find an easier place to get out of there. A wind picked up, and it started drizzling. I walked for a mile or so and couldn't find anything that I wanted to risk my neck on, or more importantly, my horse's hooves, and decided to start up the side I had come down originally. I got to the top, took a look around to orient myself, and froze in shock. The landscape was completely different. I don't mean that it was lower or easier or less rocky. I mean that all of my landmarks were gone. Some of them were peaks that were 30 to 40 miles away. Others were a lot closer. It was completely different. I had no idea where I was, and I was completely disoriented. I dug up my map and started to review where I was, the angles on the hills I had been navigating earlier. I couldn't find anything that matched. The only thing that I could possibly identify were the route up from the ravine that I had just come up. Since it was cloudy, I couldn't navigate by the sun. All I had were the landmarks that I used for dead reckoning, and those were gone. The wind was picking up, and it was getting very cold. I almost expected snow. I had no idea where I was, so I decided to backtrack to my last known position and see if I could pick up where I left off. I started down the hill, got to the bottom of the ravine, and started the opposite direction up. This time I was very careful, watching for signs of my passage before, and the hill I came down in the first place. It stopped raining, the wind died down, and the day started to warm up. I found my original trail down the hill, started back up, and I got to the top. All the landmarks were there now. I was totally confused. I kept going on the ridge, watching carefully to find where I had come up before. When I got to the spot where I thought it should be, there was no sign of it. I cast back and forth for a while, trying to find my trail with no success. All of my landmarks were there to see. Eventually I gave up and continued on the ridge. A bit later, I found an easy trail down and an easy trail back up to the other side, and continued on my way. To this day, I still have no idea what happened. Even though it was drizzling, I should have been able to see those landmarks closer, and honestly, the further landmarks were big enough to see. To that point, thinking back on it, there was no sign that it was drizzling when I continued to where I had ascended the first time, and the temperature swings were wild that day, easily 30 to 40 Fahrenheit. It's not uncommon in the mountains, but really odd for that time of year in the first place. Another thing, originally I had chosen to descend at that point because there was nothing to prevent me from going up on the other side. I could see easily from the ridgetop, but when I arrived, there were tons of boulders blocking me that I should have been able to see from the top. Eerie and creepy at the time, for sure, but I was more focused on trying to orient myself, but thinking back on it now, even more so. During the 1970s, before I was born, my dad worked as a trail guide in California. He'd lead groups of tourists on horseback across mountain trails and such, and he met a lot of people during his time there. He met this Native American guy, who started out as a regular customer, and eventually became an employee. He came from an Indian reservation, although he never said which. He also didn't explain why he left. But he was a cool guy, so my dad never really gave his origins much thought. He always figured that he'd left for personal reasons, and didn't want to be bothered about it, so my dad never brought it up. One day, my dad, his brother, and his Native American friend were out on the trail with a group of people. It was a pretty ordinary day. My dad and uncle told jokes back and forth, their friend laughing and jeering, and the tourists took pictures with their bulky cameras. Nothing unusual. As they were moving along, someone shouted, "Coyote!" and pointed into the little valley on the left side of the field. Again, nothing strange. This was in the grassy chaparral of Central California, and coyotes are a very common sight. My dad and his companions stopped their horses so that their guests could have a look at the creature. My dad and his friend got chatting, but my uncle kept staring at the coyote, with his features all scrunched up, like he was trying to get a better look at it. My dad asked him what was up, and he said, "This coyote, it doesn't look healthy." The coyote had very long and thin legs, and didn't walk normally. Most dogs walk by lifting a front leg and then lifting the opposite back leg. But this coyote walked by lifting both legs on one side of its body, sort of like a camel. Its snout was also a good 3 inches longer than normal, and it held its nose high in the air, as if it was sniffing for something. My dad said that it was probably just deformed, and my uncle agreed. Their friend, however, was silent. He was slightly shivering and staring directly at the weird coyote. My dad put his hand on his shoulder and said, "What's wrong?" With a shaking finger, his friend pointed at the coyote and said, "The tail. Look at the tail." My dad looked and said, "What do you mean? It has no tail." My friend said that he'd explain everything when they get back to base camp, so my dad led the guests down to the trail. The coyote followed them. It didn't come up from the valley, but it followed the group, The tourist thought it was fun to have a little companion, but my dad's friend never looked at it. He was silent the whole way back. When they were just a couple of 100 yards from the base camp, the coyote leapt out of the underbrush about 20 feet in front of my dad and his companions, freaking the hell out of them and the horses. The coyote stared directly at my dad's friend and smiled. Not a panting smile like most dogs do, but a full-on, teeth-bared smile, which showed off its yellow and brown-stained teeth. The friend stared back, and produced a small piece of wood with an arrow burnt into it. He showed its face to the coyote, which looked away. Then the creature howled. Coyotes' howls are usually high-pitched, but this one was very low-pitched, almost baritone. It sounded like the thing had fluid in its lungs, as if it were drowning, unable to make one final scream. Then it ran back into the bushes. My uncle, ever the jokester, turned to the stunned tourists and said, "Well, I hope you got your money's worth." At camp, my dad's friend wouldn't give them the whole story, only vague statements like, "It killed them, and now it's going to try and kill me." He said that he did this to protect my dad and uncle, because the less you know about it, the better. He gave them each a small piece of wood with an arrow on it, saying that it would protect them from the thing. He made them himself, and he said that he was glad that he got to test them out. He drove out at 8, and my dad never saw him again. My father always used to tell this story when I was younger, especially during camping trips. He's a high-spirited kind of guy, so he always tells it in good spirits. But sometimes he says that on cold nights, when the wind is blowing and there's a rustling in the trees, he can hear the low howl of the thing that was not a coyote. I went on a backpacking trip with a friend when I was younger. We did a 1-week trip backpacking a portion of the Appalachian Trail. At night, we would start a small campfire for cooking and heat. I can't even begin to explain how dark it was. There was no moonlight. It was literally pitch black. We were quietly sitting by the fire after dinner, crickets chirping and insect noises, typical sounds you'd expect to hear in the woods. The noise was loud, but not brutally loud, but loud enough that you'd notice it. We basically sat there and listened to the crackle of our fire and nature. All of a sudden, the symphony stopped on a dime. The only noise left was the crackle of our fire. Dead silence. It quickly went from relaxing to terrifying. Usually when an insect stops making noise, it's because there's a predator nearby. When every insect stops making noise, that usually indicates a pretty big predator. Mix that with how dark it was. The light from our fire basically got swallowed by the darkness. Now how could this get worse? We start hearing footsteps in the woods around us and our camping area. Not running, but creeping. Whatever it was would walk a bit, then stop, then walk a bit more, then stop. We couldn't see a thing. The words, "We are being stalked," came out of my mouth. So now my friend and I are terrified. We are as close to the fire as you can get, without actually being in the fire. We both had sidearms, and it still didn't make me feel any better or safer. So the footsteps were getting closer. Not faster, just louder. So whatever was creeping around in the woods was now heading in our general direction. At this point I'm like, well, this is how it ends. So now you have 2 guys huddled around a campfire, waiting for something to come through a wall of darkness into the firelight and maul the crap out of us. Then, we finally met our fate. A very feminine voice sang, "Hello, I'm friendly, we're coming towards you." And 2 wildlife biologists walked out of the darkness. They were studying bats. Obviously, the best time to study bats would be at night. It was a man and a woman, and they sat with us for a few minutes and told us the entire process. It was really neat to listen to. They also wanted to let us know that they'd be out and about in our area for most of the night, and they didn't want to scare us. Too late. We chit-chatted for a couple more minutes, and then they went back on their way. After they were out of hearing distance, my friend and I looked at each other, and he said, "I peed my pants to stay warm, not because I was scared. It's a known survival tactic." Up until I heard them say hello, I was honestly waiting for an angry Sasquatch to come charging out the woods, pick me up, and use me like a baseball bat to beat my friend to death. So my scariest experience in the woods was meeting 2 wildlife biologists. I do a fair amount of archery hunting when the weather permits, and trap rabbits about 3 times a year, although I do release them if they're pregnant. I used to be a vet technician and just can't do with baby bunnies. But I think the craziest thing that ever happened was when I was following some deer tracks. I had been tracking the herd for a few days, not planning on bagging one, just to observe. So I'm hauling around a tree stand and my tent and bare essentials. Before my pup got cancer, I would bring her, but she's in chemo, so it was a solo trip. I generally let her tell me when I wasn't noticing something, but without her, it got fairly creepy pretty quickly. I notice I'm losing the light and rub my face in frustration, and I'm suddenly waking up. I was just laying down, with my tent and everything set up, firewood under me, ouch, and a rip in my jacket. Nothing else to show for it, except that it was way darker than before. I checked my watch. I've got roughly 3 hours to sunrise. When/who set up my tent? They did it differently than I normally did. Okay, it's kinda just oilcloth and rope, and I travel light, but it wasn't in my usual formation. The zippers on my pack were all open. I was grasping my sheathed field blade in my left hand, and I'm right-handed. I don't know what happened. To this day, it unsettles me. One winter, when I was homeless in college, I had a mouse crawl into my tarp hideout as it was pouring buckets. It practically swam to get under the tarp, and it just sat there gasping, shivering. I gave it a cracker, and it sat with me. I eventually fell asleep for a few hours. When I woke, it was gone. But a little pile of grass and a twig with a berry on it, poisonous unfortunately, was where the mouse had been. Kinda always thought of it as a thank you. I am of Navajo descent. I'm only 1/4. My grandfather is pure. This was quite a while ago, but every summer we used to go and stay at my uncle's house. He has 3 floors, and the basement was pretty much the living room and had a slope that went above ground, so it was only half underground and had windows and everything. So for some odd reason, they leave these huge windows open at night. I've seen skinwalkers snooping around pretty often, and mainly as distant silhouettes or 6-foot-tall coyotes. Could you just be normal? So I knew exactly what to expect when you voluntarily leave a window large enough for a person to easily climb through. Let's go off on a bunny trail real quick. This situation made me uncomfortable because of stories about when we were babies. My family was staying in my Nali's trailer, and she had these individual square locks, and they woke up in the dark hours of the next morning to find all the locks on the floor and the doors wide open, and my brother missing a lock of hair. My Nali had to do some ritual or prayer or something to save him. It worked, by the way. He grew up to be successful and is currently following his dreams, but back on track. So we're all getting ready for bed. My grandma is sleeping on the couch, my brother and his friend are sleeping on the other couch, and me and my aunt were sleeping on a mattress behind the couch that my grandma was on. Everyone else went camping outside to Skinwalker hunt. Everyone got settled and went to bed, and my aunt stole my pillow. Around 1 or so, I woke up feeling uneasy. I sat up and looked around. Everything appeared normal, and nothing was in the windows but the distant flashlights that we did often see, and I went back to sleep. So here it happens. 4 a.m. I roll on my left side and see my aunt sleeping peacefully, despite having rolled off our mattress. Her hair spread across the floor, and she was completely wrapped up cozy in her blankets. Everything is normal, until I realized that my aunt was on the right side of the bed, and whatever this thing was, is not my aunt. This long black hair was not hers, and her knee, that was somewhat exposed, was some joint. It was not human. Nonetheless, you know if you get greatly injured or afraid, you either become incapacitated with fear or filled with adrenaline, right? I filled with adrenaline. I reached up my arm and grabbed the couch and flipped myself over to the other side. I woke up my grandma in doing so, and I told her to stay awake but to stay quiet, and it began to move around the couch and back out the window. It was so odd though. The way it moved so smoothly was kind of like the Heartless from Kingdom Hearts. Very snake-like. So to start off, let me say that I am naturally jumpy. I'm really wary of my surroundings. I'm not a quiet or shy person trying to avoid people. I do, however, feel like I have a great sense of when someone's wrong or strange and will try to avoid it. I'm from a country in Europe where the murder or crime rate in general is very rare. So you can imagine that people aren't afraid to walk around alone. However, I rarely go out by myself at night, just because I'm from a small town and the surrounding woods creep me out. When I'm with friends, however, I do enjoy the night strolls. So last week, me and my best friend went on our usual walk. We know the roads really well. We walk the same path every time, and together we have a lot of fun, so we never think about scary things that could happen. The first 3/4 of our path is well lit by street lamps, and there are houses around. Not a lot of them, but they're there. Then we arrive at the tunnel, and from then on there are no lights, and the asphalt road turns into a rocky/pebble one. When we get to that spot, a white van is standing in front of the tunnel, to the side of a ditch that runs there. It's not turned on, and we're quite creeped out by it. But we just joke about how someone is going to follow us. When we pass, I mention that I thought I saw the silhouette of someone inside, but my friend gets angry at me for scaring her. After we cross the tunnel, the path turns left, and you have to walk uphill. It's not a long or hard walk before you come on top of that hill and have to go down again. From that point on, you are surrounded by woods on one side and with open hop fields on the other. It's really dark, but we continue having a fun conversation for about 5 minutes or so, before the lights of something start shining from behind us, as there are a lot of farms about a mile or two ahead. So we move to the side and continue walking in order to let the car pass by. However, we look back and realize that it is not a car, but in actual fact the white van from before. We kind of freaked out, but were hoping it would just pass. It didn't. We kept walking slowly for 50 to 100 meters, and the van is slowly trailing behind us. When we speed up, we hear it rev up as well, and when we slow down, the vehicle does the same. I nudge my friend on the shoulder, look straight at her in the eye and say, "Run to the field on the left, now." We both make a run for it as fast as we can, and we almost trip on the piles of soil because there are lots of them in the hop fields. We finally jump down and hide behind one of the bumps on the ground and wait. The van stops, turns on the strong headlights, and two men exit. They have hoods on, and they're each holding flashlights shining in our direction, scanning the fields. I think a minute or so passes before they get back in the van, turn it around on the spot, and drive back from the direction we came from. We've never been this freaked out, and we just ran home through the field. The houses started again right by the end, so we felt safe when we got there. I don't know who these people were, and I've never been followed like this before, but I think we're going to be staying off the paths for quite some time now. I had just gotten out of my boyfriend's car outside my house and had walked around the front of the car to kiss him goodbye. 2 houses down, there was a street light, and all I saw from the corner of my eye was a black figure that was around 6 to 7 feet tall. Keep in mind, when I went around the car initially it wasn't there, but in the little time it took me to say goodbye, it had showed up right near the street light. From where I stood, it was 2 houses down. I was terrified and asked my boyfriend if he saw the deer too, and he told me it wasn't a deer and to slowly back away towards my house. Neither of us stopped looking at it because we were scared it was going to move. What I saw was a 6 to 7 foot, solid black figure. It had the body of a wolf, tall but not overly wide. It had what looked to be antlers on its head. It was a dark shade of black, to where even in the light you couldn't really see major details, just an outline. The thing didn't move much or fast at all, but when I first looked, it had its head down and turned away from me. But as I was backing away, it turned its head, facing straight towards me. Like I said, it was hard to see details, but its eyes were a deep blood red. I was absolutely terrified. It didn't move, just held its gaze in my direction, and I made the mistake of staring into its eyes. It was almost like a trance. I couldn't move away or walk anymore because I was petrified of moving. It didn't move or turn its head until my dad opened the door to ask what was happening. I kept my gaze, and it turned and ran off into the woods behind the house 2 doors down. It ran very fast and seemed to sway while running. It ran like a big cat would, where it sways and runs low, not like a wolf or deer would run tall, bouncing up with each step. I went inside and asked my dad if he could go over the video surveillance, since we have cameras pointing outwards from all directions except the backyard. When we went to watch over it, we saw a dark shade of something tall and big. It seemed like a blob of black, which was weird, since the cameras are night vision and heat sensitive. They picked up on cats and dogs at all times of the night, and they showed up in white. However, this huge shade moving in the same direction as where I saw the figure showed up as black. My dad deleted the video because of his views on subject retaining to paranormal or supernatural. But my current boyfriend brought up the topic of skinwalkers and explained to me what it was. We looked into it. I never cared much about what it was or why it was here. Just seeing whatever the thing was terrified me. But even to this day, just over 2 years from seeing it, my dad won't even talk about it, and until now, neither would I. If you have any answers or ideas, I'm open to hearing about what this thing could be. I grew up on the New Mexico reservation. I'm white and my stepfather is Navajo. Anyway, it's really rocky desert and a mountain-like area, like the Grand Canyon but smaller. No white people go out there. The Navajos back there and then really hated white people. You can walk all day and never see anyone. I was on my horse hunting and came to this circle-like depression in the sandstone and sand, like someone had made it a long time ago. There was no sound from animals around it, no lizards on the rocks, no birds humming. It was scaring the crap out of my horse. He was screaming and jumping and kicking, and I couldn't get him to calm down. So I got away from there and tied him up to a pinon tree in sight. I went to check it out with a weapon, of course. It was just a big circle about a foot deep, and it looked like something was built there but very long ago. I came back with friends, and with horses and dogs. The horses did the same things, and the dogs just stayed on the top of the hill whining. No one had any idea what it was, but when we told our parents, we were told to stay away from it. The only thing I could find out was that the Navajos and other Indians would put people and children who could not contribute to the tribe in a pit-like circle to die from the elements. A long time ago, if you were crippled or mentally challenged and couldn't hunt or farm, no one was going to support or take care of you. In the early 70s and 80s, growing up, I had hours of chores every day, even though I was going to school too. Exploring out there was amazing, and I've seen things that no one would believe. My grandma was a practitioner of native medicine and ceremonies. She was what Navajo people call a crystal gazer, a hand trembler. People would often come and visit her and ask for healings or causes of their ailments. At times, people would ask her to help with protection from being attacked by evil entities. My grandma used to teach my aunt and her granddaughter the rituals and ceremonies, much like an apprenticeship. My cousin was one such person that my grandma had chosen to teach her shamanistic rituals. She would tell me the weirdest and scariest stories ever. One story she told me was about a pesky skinwalker that was attacking a neighbor of my grandparents. This skinwalker would go over to their homestead and tap on the windows, open the horse corral, knock over water bottles, and just be a pest to the family. It was thought that the skinwalker was sent because of a jealous man that was infatuated with a girl that lived there, and she had refused to date a certain person. That family had visited my grandparents and asked for help, but my grandma was reluctant. A few days later, the skinwalker returned. This time it harassed the sheep herder. Its attacks were relentless, and the sheep herder was frightened and ran over to the family house in the middle of the night. The father of the house told the sheep herder to calm down and go back to his house. The sheep herder kept saying that it was calling his name, and he wanted it to stop. The father walked the sheep herder back to his house and walked around the house. He didn't see anything unusual. The next morning, the sheep herder didn't come over for breakfast, and the father went to check on him. He didn't find him there, and the front door was wide open. The father started to look for the sheep herder, and it wasn't long until he found him. He had been strangulated by a barbed wire fence that was used as the sheep corral. The sheep were also gone, more than likely because the barbed wire had been taken off the fence. The family was distraught and visiting my grandma for help. My cousin told me about the ceremony they performed to get rid of it. She said the next morning they gathered some ingredients, a Navajo ceremonial basket, and a crystal arrowhead, and she said that early in the morning before the sun rose, they began the ceremony. She held the basket and the arrowhead, and they were buried under the ingredients while my grandma was singing. The arrowhead started to rise and levitate above the basket, and it flew out of the basket, and they kept singing until the sun came up. My cousin asked where the arrowhead had went, and my grandma told her that the arrowhead took care of the skinwalker that was terrorizing the family. My cousin told me that the family had been freed from the skinwalker's curse, and that they would not have to worry about it again. I was stalked by a mountain lion once. It was the late 90s, and I will never forget the feeling of being potential prey. My boyfriend at the time and I wanted to hike in this area, in the desert, called Hellhole Canyon. Despite the name, it was a gorgeous place to hike, but far into the desert. It was early spring because the plants were still green, and there was water running in the stream. Later in the year, because everything dies up and turns brown. It had just rained too, because there were rain puddles on the trail. I saw a big print. It looked like a large dog, but no claws. Keep in mind that just like house cats, big cats have retractable claws, so that told us to be careful. But we continued to hike because it was a loop trail. Just when we got to the part of the loop that was the furthest from the trailhead, I bent down and saw some tiny paw prints that looked just like the others, except little. I started gushing about how cute they were, and that the babies must be somewhere. Then we heard the growl. It sounded almost like a rumble engine, like dirt bikes or something off in the distance. But it was not a dirt bike, and it was close. All of a sudden I realized that the birds that were previously chirping around us were dead silent. I stood up and took off my backpack to hold it above my head to make myself look larger, and told the boyfriend that we were leaving now. He heard the same thing, so he was already looking for a rock. There weren't any good hiking sticks in the area. Neither of us saw the animal, but we knew she was there. We both got big and made loud noises and walked away as quickly away from there as possible. I kind of think that if the mama cat wasn't busy with her new kittens, or if I were hiking alone, we would have been live bait. It's part of the reason I don't ever hike alone, ever. It's too easy to get caught by animals that usually leave people alone, if there is more than one. When I was younger, I lived back in my home state of Maryland, home of many things unexplainable, archaic, and supernatural. Of course, the Amish and Mennonites you see are nice, but even they fear what's out there in the primeval darkness of a full moon night. It was a cool autumn evening. The sun began to set, and the moon rose to meet it, embracing one another in a brief twilight before going their separate ways. The wind stirred the dying leaves from their branches and scattered them through the air, disturbing the stillness of the water as it glided across the lake's surface. Foxes rushed about through the tall grass, hunting muskrats and gophers alike, rabbits and hares as well. Birds sang sweet nightly laments as squirrels jumped from tree to tree, giving a playful chase as they scaled up and over the branches. Off in the distance, howling coyotes called to one another, barking and yipping to themselves as the stars dotted the sky. The final remnants of the daylight had faded. The moon rose to its ebony twinkling throne and cast down its light, pale and serenely beautiful. My family was inside having a good time. laughing, drinking, and being merry overall. But I preferred solace and solitude over such, at the time, loud barbarity. There I sat, alone on the porch, staring at the moon's reflection on the lake, watching it ripple from the breeze, when a deep snarl from below the porch brought my attention back to reality. I paused and listened, hearing another deep snarl from below the porch, and was shaken as whatever this thing was started to loot and shift through my grandfather's tools. Metal clanks against metal, wooden beams were tossed about, and from what I could hear, nails were being dragged across brick. Heavy steps made their way into the backyard, and whatever belonged to them stood tall in the pale moonlight. A creature with auburn brown coloured hair, pointed ears, and a wolf-like head, atop a lean and lanky body, with sharp claws, as it stood in the backyard, basking in the moon's radiance. Nothing had happened for a few minutes, but then its ears perked up after my family got louder, and it turned to me on the porch, sniffing the air. My heart sank a little, and just as I thought something bad was going to happen, the beast puts one clawed finger to its curled snout and shushes me. After that, it slowly turned and walked closer to the tall grass, entering the woodline soon after, never to be seen again. I went quail hunting about 10 years ago, with my stepdad and his friend. It was kind of in the middle of nowhere next to Colorado River on the California side. We thought we were alone, and one night, we hear this girl screaming in the distance. It startled us, so we grabbed our shotguns and walked towards the screaming. We rolled up on this camp about a quarter of a mile away, and it's this guy, and we presumed his girlfriend. She is visibly distraught. He about craps his pants when 3 guys roll up with shotguns. He asks if everyone is okay, and she was looking at the ground and said she was fine, and that they were having an argument. The next morning we wake up at 4 a.m. to start the day's hunt, and we walk past their camp to check on them again. They're gone. We never heard them leave. I hope that girl was okay. I've seen a lot of the usual stuff out in northwestern Canada, but the only thing that made me really think twice about going into the woods out there was not wanting to find a body. There are dozens, hundreds of unsolved missing person cases out there, many of them Indigenous men and women, and white people as well. There are signs up everywhere with information about missing. I hope they're found and that the families find some closure, but I dreaded being the one to come across a corpse. The other thing that made me think twice were the bullet holes everywhere. Blowing holes in highway signs is bad, but these guys would shoot up outhouses. Nothing like taking a dump and counting the bullet holes in front of your face. Canada has some stricter gun laws than the States, but people still make bad decisions. I was visiting my cousin's house. I have 4 cousins, 2 twin girls aged 10, and then the older brother aged 21 and 26. I was sleeping in the room with the cousin of age 21, and we heard stuff falling in the girl's room, right next to where we were. We assumed that it was just them playing, but then one of them started talking to the other, and they were across the room. So my cousin stepped out of the room to go check, and I watched over his shoulder through the doorway. Right as the girls were explaining that stuff was falling without provocation, a sort of humanoid thing came bursting out the closet. It looked humanesque, but was much longer and thinner, and ran on all 4 legs. It ran out of the house, broke the front door hinge, and straight through the screen by the door. We called the police immediately, and they were there within 5 minutes. They looked in a 5-mile radius and nothing was found. They gathered DNA from the door, and apparently this thing was cut by the shattering wood on the door, and there were small amounts of blood on it. They ran tests, and it was determined to be inconclusive. They said it was similar to human DNA, but not in the way ape DNA is similar. It wasn't a human though. They knew that. So to this day, we have had no incidents with whatever this thing is. They still live in the house and have had no problems, but we have zero explanation for what happened and what that thing was and how it got into the house. There is an ice road in northern Alberta that's only open for 3 to 4 months of the year when the rivers freeze over. Anyway, I took to the road rather than flying up a remote community where I was working for a project. It was bizarre. First of all, there's no lights except for your vehicles. It's crazy for your GPS to be like, I have no idea, man. I think you're in a river. Anyway, I pulled over to take a leak. It was an evening, so you couldn't see much. Midstream, I had a weird danger shudder and jumped back into my truck. About 15 seconds later, I saw a couple of lynx, or minks, coming down and strolling as they were sniffing around my truck. They aren't huge, but I have no doubt they could have taken me down. So I ended up peeing in an empty bottle.